work? How did they envision or actually create the project in the first place? We have Juergen Hoeller, who's the co-founder and project lead for Spring Framework. We have Emmanuel Bernard, who's a distinguished engineer at Red Hat, a Java champion, and OS contributor on Hibernate ORM, and a co-founder of Quarkus. We have Kohsuke Kawaguchi, who's the creator of Jenkins and CTO at CloudBees. And we have David Pilato, who's a developer and an evangelist at Elastic. So welcome, everyone. To begin with, this is something that I would like to hear from all of you. How did you get started with open source? And what drew you to contribute and create projects that you all work on?
So I'm starting? I have the mic then.
Please go ahead.
So I was working for the French customs some years ago, and I discovered a funny project named Elasticsearch at this moment. And I said, oh, this is interesting, this project is open source. I was also participating to some Java user group communities, the Paris Java user group, for example. And I was amazed by the fact that communities and people in communities are sharing their knowledge with other people. And that was super interesting to me. And when I discovered the Elasticsearch project, I found that basically no one was speaking about Elasticsearch in France. And I said, oh, that's interesting. So how could I contribute back to this project? I'm not that a good Java developer. I can develop in Java, but I'm not as smart as the people who created Elasticsearch, for example. So I said, how I can contribute? And I said, okay, I can contribute to the documentation. Right, this is the right thing to do. If you're starting in an open source project, you can fix documentation issues or increase the documentation. And then I started to contribute some plugins around Elasticsearch, not in the core itself, because I did not have enough knowledge to do that, but as plugins. So that's how I started. And then I said, I need to spread the world about this amazing technology. And I say, okay, let's try to engage with the Paris Java user group, for example, or DevOps France at this period to communicate and share my passion about that project. And this is how all started for me. And this is how I was embracing a new community and the open source model in general.
That's cool. So I guess for me, I started it because people that I respected were doing it, right? So I was young enough, I wasn't thinking, I wasn't planning, oh, I'm gonna pick open source because of these reasons. I was just, okay, I'm gonna do what the cool kids are doing, basically. But maybe another part of it is, we write software because we want that to be used by people, right? And that, I don't know about you, but for me, that's what motivates me. And then, so if you wrote a software that's meant to be used by fellow developers, I thought the fastest and also easiest way to make that happen is just put it in open source, and somehow magically people from around the world start picking that up, and I feel great. So that's for me, it's kind of how I go going.
Okay, so me, it's a bit of a funny story knowing the future. So I was at a retail company, and we were defining the new stack, right? So .NET versus Java and so on. So we went, so Java got decided, and then an app server, and then at someone we were like, okay, we don't want to write JDBC, so let's use an object relational mapper. And the big one at the time was Toplink. So we were like, okay, let's go and get Toplink. We continue, and then Toplink is acquired by Oracle, and the company had a DB2 policy, and we decided to go for BEA, which wasn't in Oracle at the time. So very different day, very different than today. So exactly. Our manager was like, okay, we cannot have BEA and then in between Oracle and then at the bottom IBM DB2, because from a support point of view, they will just bounce the ball to one another. So find a different solution. We're like, okay. And then we found this, so IBM Global Services actually was helping us and said, hey, there is this interesting open source project named Hibernate. It's really cool, and I look at it, and it's like 2.something beta 4, and I'm like, are you sure? So I dig into it, and then I like it, and I go back to the manager saying, so you prefer we do the support, but less experience than having this product? It's like, yes. okay. But I took it seriously and I wanted to learn the technology, so I read the doc, started to help on the forums, in my case, in the forums. And after a while, they felt that was kind of an answering machine, so they said, okay, please join the team, and then I started to contribute some work. And that's how, at some point, Java 5 was coming, and annotations, and I started to work on the annotation versions for Hibernate.
That reminds me of my the very same period, I'm sure, toppling CocoaBase. Actually, Hibernate 2.0 beta releases. It's we entered that space at exactly the same time. I was a software architect at that time for a product company, so also in charge of persistence architectures and everything else, web architectures in particular. Was an early follower of the Apache Struts project, Apache Tomcats, where you could barely build it, the way you got it from the Apache Software Foundation. It was the early days. But Apache Struts was interesting. This kind of web framework that Craig McClanahan kind of coded up on an evening in a hotel room, and it turned into the most popular web framework that the Java space has seen at the time. And of course, to some degree, it showed, right, in the design that it was a few hours in a hotel room. Apache Struts was an interesting story that I followed closely. I was there in the room at Java 1 in the BOF session when Craig announced the GA release, the 1.0 GA release. So I followed it very closely, but I was never really happy with it. From my perspective, I totally liked this open source aspect, the community aspect that Struts was at the time already really showing. There were a lot of people contributing, and I remember that BOF session at Java 1, plenty of people involved there. I really loved that part of it, but not so much the design. So I figured open source frameworks are great, but there's really room for improvement for application frameworks, for web application frameworks in particular. Took a bit of time from there, like about a year and a bit after that. I got that book, Expert J2E Design Development, into my hands. December 2002-ish, and read that book cover to cover. There was this prototype for a framework in there, without a name at the time, based on the ideas in the book. And I thought, well, that's kind of, it's a download, its source code is available, but I was very familiar with how open source projects were running, Struts and the early versions, the early days of the Hibernate project. So I figured, let's turn this into a proper open source project. I got in touch with Rod Johnson on the feedback forum, the publisher feedback forum for the book. Like, what about taking this onto SourceForge and turning it into a properly managed, actively developed open source project? And that's exactly what we did, just barely 2 months later, in February 2003. And that was my entrance into the open source space as an active contributor. And it was active from day one at that point, because Rod was saying, you know what, I'm totally up for this, but I really need to share the work. We can only have like at least a co-leadership, so I figured I'll make the jump. I'm up for that. But I was basically from an observer, I turned into a very active co-project lead role very quickly.
Just so listening to the various answers, what I found funny is like, so David is like, you know, I'm not good enough of a coder, but I'll find my niche, right? Kohsuke was like, I didn't know better, I didn't know I couldn't do it, so I did it. Me, I didn't say it, but I was very impressed. My first patch, and we were actually doing patch files at the time, you know, SVN and all that. I read it, I don't know how many, you know, 100 times to make sure it was as good as possible, not to be like just bash by saying, oh, there's this bug and that bug and that bug. So I was very impressed. And you said, you know, I've got the confidence, I want something very well designed, and then you know, started this, this project and then the community. So it's very diverse. I found that very interesting.
I want to say to the audience, if there's a particular topic in the conversation that you really like, please do button and ask your questions in, because this is actually your time to pick their brains. If not, I just keep going with my predefined list. So it's awesome that you spoke about how you all started contributing. Do you have any tips for developers who are looking for contributing into open source, how they can get started?
I'll start. So I think what David said is a very good angle. If you're afraid of the code to some extent, go for documentation, go for presentations, like call it user experience, so that you don't claim that you know perfectly the framework, and nobody does. And you know that's an angle. Open a bug with a reproducible test. Every bit counts. And what I don't know about you, but what we recognize is more like the persistence. If somebody shows up to say, hey, here is a problem, and then moves on, that's great. But if we see somebody coming and being persistent, that's how he's becoming a bigger part of the community, and that's how he can become, you know, integral part. That can then be a job, but that's almost like a parallel story.
All right, so since you talked about the importance of like a non-code contribution, which I think needs to be emphasized, but I want to talk about something else. And so I think maybe one thing that I want to communicate is like, when there's like a carnival going on, like you want to be in there. And then like, so Java 1, so you talked about early Java 1, and I think there was this definite feel of like, I don't know exactly what's going on here, but something is going on. And like there's a lot of half-baked stuff, and you said like you looked at this like a Craig's struts, and oh, I know how to do it better. And then I think whenever there's a carnival, like there's always that feel. And then right now that's happening in like in the KubeCon and like a cloud native space. You see tons of half-baked stuff, and lots of people excited about it. And if you're a developer, like you see those, and then you see like it just comes naturally to you, like, oh, I can do this, and I can do this better. And I think maybe part of the Asian mentality is like, oh, but you know, I don't know anything about it. These are smart people, so maybe I shouldn't. And then I think if you're a little bit like a Don Quixote, like you don't let that kind of Asian humbleness get in your way, then maybe that's part of the key.
Yes, so I forgot to say something, and you remind me to say that. So I was also contributing to the forum, the open forum of Elasticsearch. So at first I was asking questions, and I was getting answers, but at some point I started to give answers to people. And a lot of time I was giving false answers, like bad answers. I was wrong, right? But that was not an issue, because some other people from the community was correcting and fixing my answers, and I learned a lot from my own mistakes, right? So don't be afraid in general. I mean, if you want to contribute to an open source project, documentation is one of the things, and speaking in forums is super important. Have a presence in a forum, even though you are saying something bad. Don't be afraid of that. We are not judging the fact that you are saying something wrong. We really appreciate that you are participating to conversation, and that's the only point. Having a community is built of people who are making good things and doing mistakes. That's not an issue at all. So yeah, this is basically my story with Elasticsearch, because I was one of the main active contributors in the forums, even though I was doing a lot of mistakes. I have been hired by Elastic then, because I was one of the most contributors of this forum. So it's important for your career growth as well. If you want to, if you embrace a community like this one, or like the other one that we have, then probably you will find a way to, I don't know, increase your resume or have more visibility if it's come to documentation issue or what have you, or forums, or it can help you a lot, I think.
The other elephant in the room is do something you like. So there is this idiom saying you scratch your itch, right? So you got a problem and you think, okay, I'll do a solution. I don't know if it's great or not, but it's solving something. And then there will be aggregation around that if it's really something that is shared by other people. So I think that should be your driver more than the fear of like, oh, I don't know, these guys know better. It's, I'm not saying it's nonsense, but let's focus on the positive side.
It's very different. Kind of the dynamics of an open source contribution model are very different now than, say, 15 years ago. 15 years ago, it really, there was like almost a barrier that you had to jump over, sort of sending patch files or some way. The issue management of the times, it's all in much better shape now. Right? On GitHub issues, pull requests, of course, right? It doesn't get easier than that, really. But I totally agree that that there's many forms of contributions, and everybody kind of finding themselves in seeing a problem or identifying a gap of sorts. Documentation contributions, I find them super important. as the author or even as a team responsible for documentation, you don't find those things. You can read them as often as you want. Other pairs of eyes are much better at helping to improve the documentation. So that's super important. Or just any form of it took me several hours to find out about this. Why isn't this more obvious? That kind of feedback, right? Without a concrete suggestion in which way it should be better. Sometimes you only see the problem, then report the problem, even if you don't have a concrete idea for a solution. That's okay, but we want to learn about the sorts of problems that you stumble upon. So it's this contribution or this feedback loop in an open source project, to me, is the essential part. Availability of the source code is one thing, right? In many ways you get that all over the place under all sorts of licenses. The JDK library source code was available for so many years, but under basically just look at the source code, don't do anything with it, that sort of model. A real open source project with a community, the source code is actively evolving, right? It's alive basically, never done. So this feedback loop is never going to end. It goes on, and you can very easily be a part of it. Of course, if it comes out of your everyday work, then this is a very immediate part of your, well, solution or problem solving within your job, right? Take a few minutes and report it to the project as well. Don't just try to solve it internally within your team. Reaching out and creating a problem report might really pay off if it comes back to you with a good suggestion or even a patch in the next maintenance release, right? So there's a lot of value in this, but there's even more value for us because we need that feedback loop. Otherwise, we would be in a silo, kind of dreaming up things, and we need that connection from an open source maintainers perspective, that connection to the real world, to usage of the stuff that we're doing, because I think you said it, I also want the stuff to be used, right, and to be usable. There's always room for improvement in usability.
I'm going to complete this. I'm sure you remember when you first pressed the push button to make your code public, the first public thing that you did in your life. Did you remember that? Do you remember that? No, when it was? Yeah, so that was a patch, okay. So that was maybe your first Jenkins, or not Jenkins, what was the name before? Hudson?
Well, no, it was long before that. So, I mean, I had a whole lot, like I have literally hundreds of open source projects before I, so I don't remember the first one.
Okay, so I'm the only one then to remember exactly when this happened. So I was speaking with Shai Bannon, so the author of the Elasticsearch, and I was telling him that I just created a plugin for Elasticsearch that was a RSS river, what we call. And he was telling me, okay, just publish it. And I said, no, I don't have all the test coverage, the code is not super documented, and I don't like my code that well. And he told me, and who cares, actually? Just publish it and wait for the community to fix your code or to help you to increase the quality of your code. And this is what I did. And everything started from this point, right? I became someone who is publishing something to the public. And then this code was used by other people. And I was super excited, as you said, that my code was used by other people, and my code was also fixed by other people. So whatever the quality of the code you can publish, do it. That's it.
So be inquisitive. That's where we start with creators. We have one question from the audience. Unfortunately, I have to walk towards you. Okay. For the mic or for you all? So if I can summarize, so how do you pick a right project without feeling overwhelmed in having to understand the project first, and how do you get started with something simple? Right. Which project to pick? How do you get started if once you've chosen?
Hey, I know Jenkins, but no. But so it's actually interesting because, like, for me, I don't, the order in which I did things is like, I had an idea of like, you know, if this software exists in the world, that would be nice. So I write them. And then like the best way to kind of create a bigger impact is to open source it. So that's for me the order in which we did things. So you seems to be going at the different directions of like, I want to join the open source festival. So how do I do that? I feel like there are some projects, well, the project is the established history is usually the better ones because it's time tested. And also in more mature project, the community think about how to bring on the new people on board. So like outreach effort, onboarding effort, like Google Summer Code program, like all these things, I think it makes it a lot easier for newer people who are trying to figure out how to do open source to get in. So maybe that's how I recommend it to you.
So I would say that don't contribute to a project because you have to contribute to a project, right? The way I'm seeing the contribution to project is, so how I'm selecting project is because I'm using those projects. And when I'm using a project, maybe I can find an issue, a bug or whatever, or I can find a way to enhance a project or add a new feature. And so my interest is not because a project is well known or not well known, it's just because I'm using it. And if I'm using it in production, I have an issue, then I prefer to open an issue, first step, then contribute a pull request if possible, why not, or a documentation fix or what have you. So this is the way I'm seeing the contribution.
I do agree with you that it's difficult. I think it's way more difficult than when we got started because Linux was a thing already, but the middleware had no notion of open source. We started it well a bit after the initial Apache thing. So right now it's like overwhelming, almost like you're a developer and there's plenty of jobs, right? But if I have to go to the core of it, you're going to work on it for free instead of going out. So choose something you really love, even if, so I said, something that scratch, well, a niche that you need to scratch. It might be for work, but it might also be just, I love the energy around, say, Elasticsearch, and therefore I'm not using it in my real job, sorry, but then I'll just contribute because I like it, I love it, and that probably should be your initial driver.
Yeah, I see it very much the same way. The primary contributions out there come to projects that are being used, or maybe to projects that are used in the same domain, but you're not allowed to use them at work, but you kind of understand the domain, you have an interest in that problem space, and it's you know about an open source project in that problem space, and you figure that's a good way to get engaged and to learn something along the way. Myself, actually, going back to the very early days, my first contributions were to Genie and Java Spaces as part of my diploma thesis. That wasn't actually a real open source project. It was like a Sun-run source code is available, and more like the 1999 days. And this probably qualifies my earliest contributions. A little bit later to Forte for Java. There was the predecessor of the NetBeans IDE. To the web application development plugins, I contributed a bit. So I guess those were my first publicly visible contributions. But I actually do, by the way, I do remember the first upload to the SourceForge.net upload of what we had at the time in February. I do remember it. You're not the only one. But anyway, in picking a project, you need to relate to it and to the problem space behind it. That's the most important part. If you can use it in your everyday work, then of course it's a win-win situation. You're going to learn something, you contribute to an open source project, you benefit from the contribution by it coming back to you in your work project, in your real life project. That's of course the ideal situation. But there are many hobby scenarios or student scenarios out there where contributors act out of other forms of motivation. We have in the Spring Framework project, we have many contributions where I sometimes wonder, how did people find out about these things? And I sometimes ask, and then they say like, well, I am using Spring in production in my day work, but at night I figured I'll read up on some part of the framework that I wasn't so familiar with, and in the process of reading up on it, I looked through the source code a bit and found out about this, right? It's like, okay. So there are many ways of getting there. It doesn't always have to be the exact part that you're using, but a relationship with the framework and the problem space is essential.
Sure. Yep.
Something that we tried at Elastic, I'm not sure, I don't know if you are doing the same thing. So when we have someone who wants to contribute to the project the first time, so the first question is asking, so what issue I can take to start with the project, for example, and to start coding something which is maybe trivial, but okay, so how you can do that. So now with GitHub and the labels that we have in GitHub, we have a low-hanging fruit label that anyone can use, and then you can see what is the most trivial thing that you can do in Elasticsearch as a contribution, and then it's super easy to start with that. And then we have a process with the engineering team where anyone in the engineering team who is going to do the code review will help you to get there and to get your contribution merged. It can take weeks, months, whatever. We don't care about that. The important thing is that at the end of the day, you have contributed something to the project. So do you have something similar in your project, like the most easy issues that people can fix?
Yeah, I mean, we try to do these things, right? Like I know the newbie bug fix and so on, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess I do the extra step. I try to ask people to, so I know Spring, for example, had a high quality barrier. Historically, for the stuff I work on, I try to have that. Frameworks or have different levels, right? But when you have a high barrier, it can be very daunting to say, oh, it's great, but here is the feedback you've got. And you got a pull request with like a massive amount of feedback, and you're like, oh my God. Yeah. So we try to be conscious of that, to be a bit gentle, and sometimes say, okay, you didn't do this part quite correctly, but it's just you didn't know, so I did it for you. Try to help for the first experience, not to be like that. It would take like a month for the initial one. I think that would be a bit. Yeah, of course.
I think let's move on to the next part of so contributions is one big aspect of from an open source perspective. But like you said, Emmanuel, when we're looking at contributions from users, it's mostly free. It's something that gets added to the library. But when you have companies like Elastic or Pivotal or Red Hat, and who pay developers to maintain open source projects, so how does that work, and what are the dynamics behind a company who's trying to maintain and create projects?
Okay. I guess there's going to be some similarities here, at least with Red Hat, I'm sure. The journey that I took the Spring Framework through saw many environments. I mean, it's like the fourth corporate environment that we're in now, and so we've also seen different business models and different ways of the question of how do you pay the developers is closely related to this kind of notion of professional open source. There's an expectation that if there's a company not necessarily directly having a business model for the project, but indirectly benefiting from being the primary owner, the primary contributor. There's many indirect benefits that a company can reap, the upselling that you can do to that community, the subscriptions that include support for those particular open source projects. And there's an expectation, of course, in professional open source that that those companies also sponsor the developers. That's the way I see it, right? It's effectively in many larger corporations, there's no specific individual revenue expectation from a particular open source project. It's more like in a larger picture, in a larger combination of projects, in a larger stack that people buy a subscription for, that larger corporations buy a subscription for. These projects may be an essential part of it. And at Pivotal, that's certainly the case. The cloud native subscription, this Pivotal Spring runtime subscription now that includes like OpenJDK and Tomcat, basically, and Spring, essentially the entire stack. For those kinds of business models, we are an essential part, but we are being sponsored to work on the open source project. It's a little bit like wearing different hats. So like in my everyday work, I wear an open source hat. I work with other stakeholders in the open source project on a basically eye-level perspective. Whether those are internal within Pivotal or external doesn't really matter to me. But every single day, I do appreciate the privilege of being basically paid by Pivotal, sponsored by Pivotal, to work on this open source project 100% of my time, right? So it's a kind of interesting relationship that you have. I have heard from other people working at the Eclipse Foundation, at the Apache Software Foundation in particular, that they see it very much the same way. So if they work on the open source project, they wear that open source project's hat, right, in making decisions, in treating contributions. It's all very interesting dynamic in there. But it needs to be like this. If there's too much corporate ruling into an open source project, then it's not a real community-driven open source project. Then it's, well, a software product with source code availability. Many early day open source projects were like this. Eclipse initially was an IBM project with published source code, the way the JDK was run for a long time. Arguably that's still the case, sort of, right? But anyway, so there's many different ways of arrangements, but a sort of clean separation between the open source aspects of the work and the more corporate aspects is important. The combination is what makes it successful in the real world.
Yeah, I agree with you. So it's a super wide question, actually. So let's take the other side angle. So I work on something, a company benefits from it, but I like it and so on. I might be hired by this company because that's, as a company that wants to grow and speed up its involvement on an open source project, they look at contributors, because that's better than going for an interview and having a resume. You're seeing what the contribution of the person is, so that's the best, right? So that's a big part. It's also very organic. Well, I still don't quite know how. Well, it's very subtle. It's a bit like you know, quantum mechanics and general relativity, in the sense that you understand that you know, the global value is where people put money in, and you understand that you need to have people working on that stuff. But the link in between is a bit magic, because you know, we do give stuff for free, but still we're paid. That's just insane, right? So it's very, not symbiotic, but it's a very dynamic model where if a company says, oh, there is Red Hat behind it, or Pivotal behind it, or Elastic behind it, therefore they owe me things, it's not working quite like that, because the business model is much more or kind of a win-win contribution. Some people will not give money, some people will give some. So some customers, they don't have to, they maybe have the knowledge to really self-support, but they give it as a well understanding of the ecosystem of the community, for example. So that's a bit of a fascinating area. I think I had all the stuff with that.
Well, so kind of taking this to a little different direction, I do think it really fundamentally changed the landscape of open source, because I mean, back then, for example, in Apache, right, there was this, I guess, the idealism that we are all just individuals, and then, yeah, we might, our interests might be somewhat aligned with our employers, and they might sponsor some of my time to do it, but like, you are not representing your employer when you're talking about the project in those spaces. But now I think the companies are more driving, they have a clear objective in mind in driving projects, like Elastic is probably one, like Google, when they do Kubernetes, their goal is to destroy Amazon. It's like, no, there's no, it's not done because of charity, it's to drive the business interest further. And when these like developers are in the, so what that does is the developers that hired full time, they also operate on different time frame. Right, they can make decisions a whole lot more faster, because they know all the other people that's key involved, so they can talk over phone. And then the rest of the contributors around the world, I don't think there's any denying that there's an asymmetry there. Like, it's a whole lot harder for like a random contributor to become like a leadership role in that kind of projects, better or worse, right? I mean, and I don't want to like bash companies, like mine is one of those. Thanks to this like a corporate interest aligned with open source, that's why we suddenly see explosion of open source. There's a whole lot more of open source going on, because we can make it economically viable, right? So I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I think it's a very substantial shift. It sounds like we kind of belong to the same generation of open source in Apache days, but now it's not like that.
Just one. So, two things that made me I want to react to is, already forgetting one. First of all, I think Spring, Red Hat, we are somewhat selective in what we decide to support and invest, because very quickly you drain and you got one guy supporting 10 projects on the payroll, and it just doesn't work. So there will actually be, let's call them satellite areas where we're like, you know, it would be great that there is a community here. We're not going to be able to contribute much as you know, Red Hat or Pivotal, but if there is a lead here that is emerging, then great, and you can have those things. I do agree with you that it's not so much they can talk on the phone, it's that they can work on it 10 hours a day, and you can only work on it at night, so that makes a difference. Just catching up on the number of emails is a bigger thing. The other point is there are communities working without money, great, like Debian is you know, like probably the best example. When you make a choice, I agree that there is open source and there is communities, and that's different in the sense that you need, when you make a choice of a product to, you know, invest in personally or with your company, think about the community. Do you think it's sustainable? What are their value? How are they running the show, essentially, if they run the show, if there is a organization? That's an important, because there's so much options, you need to consciously make that choice. That's part of you as an engineer to help your company make the right bets.
So I'm going to be short, I think. I just want to add two things. One thing is the interesting thing that GitHub announced recently, that they can help to fund some open source project now. So that's a super cool thing, I think. And the other thing is a quote from Shay Bannon, who was saying recently that open source is not a business model, it's only a distribution model. And this is super important to have that in mind. This is a way to reach a lot of people, but you cannot really consider open source as a business model. You need to find a business model just close to the open source activities that you have. Okay.
Sure.
I totally get Shay's point, but it is more than a distribution model from my perspective. It is a development model as set up for contributions. If it is just a distribution model, then we're basically where the JDK is roughly. That is more of a distribution model really in practice. Or there are a few open source projects out there, and not every open source project is the same. I'm not even saying one is necessarily better than the other. It needs to work for the particular purpose that the project has been set up for and for the team that runs it. But it can be significantly more than a distribution model. I totally agree, it's not a business model. It cannot be a business model on its own. I guess that's what he really meant.
Just to put some context, this conversation, if you don't have the context, it's the whole, let's have a company that is sustaining an open source project and having a cloud provider that just essentially fork your stuff and here is the support and just ignore you all afterwards, and then this whole war and escalation of things going on. That's what I like about communities and the open source community, generally speaking. We're actually openly discussing those things. It's not like behind closed door and having strategic meetings and whatnot. It's like, okay, what does it mean to be an open source community? What does it mean to have a business around that? And how do I sustain it when another massive AWS level member comes in and just essentially says, okay, I'm going to support this stuff and give you $0 whatsoever and not contribute, and that's fine because that's my retail-based model. How do I survive that, right? There is lively debate right now happening in communities.
If I may, one more, just because this is, it shows many facets of, it really is a very wide question to answer, but collaboration between different companies, different vendors through open source setups is also an essential part that we're seeing in the Java enterprise space in particular, where collaborating on a commercial product is extremely hard in terms of IP assignments, in terms of a fair usage model for everyone involved. Setting it up as an open source project, CLAs like license attributions in place, is a way for several vendors with commercial interests and commercial add-on or stack options on top to collaborate on the same open source project. The JDK that's what it really is, right? Primarily Oracle, then it's IBM, Azul, very few contributors, all with commercial JDK distributions, collaborating on this canonical open source project. Or I guess like Weld and Hibernate Validator are embedded in plenty of commercial application server distributions by other vendors that are actually, well, competitors, sort of, right, to Red Hat, at least to certain products at Red Hat. And I find this dynamic quite interesting, that open source is a kind of consensus for how commercial vendors can contribute or can collaborate on a particular piece of technology, piece of infrastructure that they both need or that they all need without any one of them really owning it. So that's another aspect that we are going to see more of this, I'm sure.
One tiny point, if I may.
Okay.
I'm a little bit with Kohsuke in the sense that I think that I don't love the idea of an open source community of vendors that are collaborating if there is no also with it an open source community of users and capacity to contribute. So there are communities and communities. Again, you know, pay attention to how things are going.
So actually, you know, I was feeling like, wow, see, because we grew up in Java age, and that was actually a great example of like a vendors with their conflicting interests working together in open source, and that because of that, it made like that ecosystem stronger. But right now, I feel like this like inter-vendor collaboration, I think, is somewhat in decline from those Java days because I feel like more and more open source projects are single vendor driven. Right? Like, you know, Elastic is like, you know, Elasticsearch is Elastic's thing. Like, it's difficult for the other companies to like step up to the similar role, like a better or worse. So, I think, yeah, I just wanted to put there. I think that's a challenge. I think the foundations, open source foundation, need to play a bigger role. Historically, Apache played that role. Apache and Eclipse doesn't have the kind of prestige they used to have anymore. And you know, I don't think it's getting filled fast enough.
Why is that though? Why wouldn't Apache, something like Apache?
You're putting fuel on the fire now.
I wanted to actually have a 2-hour panel if Michael would allow it, but yeah. Yeah. So what can we do as a community and as companies in order to bring back the Apache spirit?
I think this conversation is a lot more interesting if you have beer, so that's good. Yeah, so I mean, in part because I think, well, maybe positive way to put it is like, you know, the corporation find ways to make like money out of open source. So they were able to do a lot more open source. So in some sense, like you shouldn't see Apache doing less. It's like other guys doing a whole lot more. Right. So I think that you can see it as a positive thing. And then maybe the other thing is, so on the other hand, it's because the company can more clearly drive their business interests. Like, I used to work for Sun, right? We had zero idea how to make any business out of open source. But hey, it sounded like a good thing. You know, it's a good idea, so let's do it. And then, so I think those naive days are like, I think, over, really. Yeah.
I think, so let me draw a parallel. I think working with other people is harder, right? So I think we have the same problem with standards right now. So the JCP is having lots of issues. I won't go into the details here. But I think, you know, deciding to go and join Eclipse or Apache or a standard of sorts is taking more energy. And right now it looks like people say, no, we want the feature right now and the delivery. And that's why you get those, you know, sort of single vendor generated project that try to address those problems in a global space, because you, as developer, are just saying, okay, I don't want so much a choice. Once I go there, I want the all-included, everything works fine kind of model. That's the sort of soft feeling that I have, and I think that's driving a little bit this. But you know, sorry, in our industry is actually cyclical, so I'm sure this will come back up at some point. You know, we see the CNCF, which to me is not quite like Eclipse or Apache, because that's very vendor-driven. I would love to have more users and actors into that kind of community to bring balance to the force.
So I just wanted to cover like all aspects of the panel because we're also running short of time. So few questions on team dynamics. I mean, I'm working as part of companies which develop open source and also disseminate information, being evangelists and so on. Do you have teams who are co-located in the same time zone as you are, or do you have remote teams? And how do you build trust within these teams? And especially it's like a mix of people. You have people who are working for you, people who are from different, from the same foundation, from different companies working on the same project, or even volunteers. So how do you build trusting teams around so many different people?
I guess I'll pick that up for a start. I'll hand it over right next. As far as I see, both within our teams and the teams around us, a distributed team is the norm in open source development. I'm not aware of many open source development teams that are really co-located. There are some, even at Pivotal, newly started projects. I'm pretty sure that in some single vendor scenarios, teams might be co-located. But in particular, in any form of larger and more collaborative environment, distribution is the norm, which can be a good thing because it means you don't need to be in the same location, right? You can become a contributor, even a very active contributor, even a member of the team, without having to be in a particular location. And that can be a strategy. It is for some teams of ours where we don't want a co-located team. We're basically trying to pick long-time contributors wherever they are. It's up to their own where they want to be located. The matter of trust is a very important part of it, though. You need to get to know each other. So what we did when we onboarded people the last time, 5 years ago, the Spring Framework team has the same 6 people since like early 2014, if I'm not mistaken. But we had a round of 3 new people in a team of 6. That's a lot. So because of some people changed to other portfolio projects. So onboarding is an essential part of the process, and the way we handled it back then is really a mentoring model. In my case, I even invited basically the people that I mentored, right? The people I was going to work with very closely afterwards, for some co-located work, right? Like to my place, or just spending time together and spending like a whole week, an intense week together, can really get you very far because you get to know each other. You pair develop, you talk about many things. You spend the entire day, right? So you also get to know a little bit of the behind the developer role, the actual person behind it. So that is all important. Once you establish this a certain relationship among each other, among the team, you can take it from there. And that works pretty well, even if you're not co-located, if you're a distributed team and you only meet, in our case, like twice a year. Not more often than that, usually. But there needs to be this, you basically, for years you can draw from this initial phase, this intense phase of getting to know each other and learning how to collaborate between those specific people. The smaller a team, the more important it is. But it is one of the reasons why our teams are really very stable. Basically the same people for a long time. It really helps. Onboarding takes some heavy lifting initially. Once it's rolling, once it's working, it can be a great and very smooth process, even in a distributed setup. So,
but that's for people paid by Pivotal, right? Or are you thinking more? Okay.
Mostly. It's really we do differentiate between membership, like actual a role in the team, and contributors, right? For contributors, building trust is bit more of a looser process, of course. But
so let me try and tackle this one. So yeah, distributed for sure. Co-location means you're excluding. And when you try to say, oh, I'm going to have a hybrid model, it's going to be great. It's just a disaster. So either you're fully distributed or you're fully co-located. But I think for open source, it has to be fully distributed. And yes, at conferences like that, you usually say, hey, I'm the contributor, John. It's like, oh, I never saw your face because you have this weird cartoon as GitHub, icon. So you make it, you have conversation, you have, water or drink or, something. But that physical aspect, I agree, is like very important, maybe a once a year at least kind of thing to you know how debates can be heated on the internet, right? So you need to calm it down by physically be together.
Yeah, so I'm gonna make like a more attention-grabbing headline that is like, you know, we don't build trust as in. So I kind of like I take it as the other version of like a Conway's law. So, you know, the building trust is costly, very, very costly. And then if you're trying to create this like a ragtag bunch of weekend contributors together to do something, like if they need to build trust each other, then nothing really gets done. So I find a great success in like architecting things in ways that compartmentalize so that everyone gets to have their sandbox. So in Jenkins terms, that's plugins. So like you have idea, like, you know, so people like they have ideas, they want to do stuff. Like for those folks, building trust and setting the ideas and knowing other people, it just takes too much time and too much investment. So just give everyone their sandbox. Like you can write your own plugin. No matter how crazy the idea is, I don't care. Right? And then let the best one wins and that gets sorted out. I think that's my model.
Just beyond trust, that's a scalability model to compensate for the distribution and the time zone problems, because you don't have to communicate that much if you are in your own semi-isolated universe.
So, just to be short, we have the same, we have been built with the same way as the Spring Source. So basically we have the same onboarding process and all those things. One of the things I want to add is that any time we are onboarding someone, we trust this person. This is by default. Why? This person does not have to prove that we have to trust him. We just trust him. But then if he starts to lie or try to, we can say that, hide the dust under the carpet, for example, then we are going to have some problem with this person. So we expect to those person, and this is what we are telling them when we are onboarding those people, that when they join, they need to tell the truth, whatever the truth is. I can't not do that part of the code because I'm not qualified enough to do that code. That's fine. You just have to say that. You don't have to say something like, I don't think that this part of the code is a good thing to do because you don't have the knowledge to code it, right? So just be frank and that will be perfect.
And trying to build trusting teams, also it starts from, everybody talked about onboarding, so it starts with hiring the right people. So what do you look for when you're trying to hire people in your interviews or your job statements?
So me, I look very strongly around independence. So somebody capable of owning a subject and driving it, because we don't want constant communication. I don't want to micromanage. I'm not a manager, but we don't want some sort of micromanagement. We want independence and trust and ownership. Well, that's the new management model anyways these days, but I think this is one of those that was also root in open source, I think.
Yeah, I find just generally encouraging people to do more, and then that has amazing results in every area. Yeah, exactly, for free, and then a compliment is free. Right? Just give them more visibility and they step up.
The communication part is also very essential to what we are doing. Even for people that have been around for a long time, you're not always able to communicate, right? It's a lot of it is offline. Of course, you can put something on Slack and hope that by the morning you got a reply or by email, whatever. But the most efficient communication is the one that you don't have to have, right? Where at some point, many years ago, one of the early contributors, one of the early team members in Spring was putting it like this, that in order to avoid communication, he would, if he faces a design problem, he would always ask himself, what would Juergen do? Right? He was, and I really loved that approach. So he wasn't asking me, he wasn't reaching out to me, although I was his mentor. He was trying to kind of, first of all, reason about what I would say if he asked me. And I really loved it, and I'm applying that myself very often, ever since. Like, what would Rossen say? I don't have to ask him necessarily. If you know each other pretty well, if there's a long relationship between those people, you can often predict what they would say, and kind of optimistic clocking sort of style. You basically proceed along what you assume he would say, and if for any reason that there's a disagreement, afterwards you roll it back. You can always revert to commit or redo the design decision, right? But you can actually get pretty far with this kind of active minimalism in communication.
I need to talk to that person so that I can build my mental model of my wife, so that I still have a problem.
It helps in many life situations, right?
The other key is it's not a 100 people team. It's usually, I mean, 10 is already pretty massive for most open source projects. So try and keep it small. That means less communication. And yes, create plugins. These are can have their own teams or whatever satellite approach extensions, whatever.
I think we've reached the end of our panel, and next time I guess we should have like an hour and a half for the panel discussion. But I'd love to open open it for audience questions.
If you see most of the happening open source projects now, those are by pure play software companies or big web companies like LinkedIn, Facebook, etc. We also have companies in banking and finance, health, etc., healthcare, etc., etc. So these companies have their own use cases, and maybe my observation is wrong, but we don't see that many open source projects or frameworks from companies that are not into pure play software or big web enterprises. Why is that? And what should be done if you want to see frameworks and open source contributions from other companies? Am I making it clear? Or?
Yeah. So I don't know, I guess. But one comment I would say is that the more niche you are on a subject, the harder it is to actually create a community because there is less potential actors. So if you say I'm going to write a, I don't know, on the moon retail framework, then you're the only one doing it, so nobody will be interested in contributing. So that's one key aspect. The other aspect is more, I think, a more general mentality where I don't know who said that, Andreessen, I suppose. It's like every company is a software company in a given specific business. A lot of companies haven't done that mental shift yet. I think when they've done that mental shift, it's kind of a positive cycle where they think software, they think they want the best. To hire these kind of people, they need to let them express their freedom and express that outside. That's salary is one thing, but a key aspect is also, well, maybe that's ego, I don't know, but pushing your card to the outside is also an important aspect for people.
I think there's a growing awareness among the employers that the opportunity to work on open source is an employee retention benefit for developers. So in technology conference, I don't think I saw them here, but in technology conference in general, there's lots of end user companies showing up to do basically recruiting. And then they are doing open source because, hey, our org is cool, and therefore if you work for us, you can get to do these things. So I think the part of it is like we, the engineers who want to work on open source, we need to sell it to our org in ways that aligns with their interest, right? If you tell them that it's a cool project that I want to work on, like your boss might not say yes. But if you tell him that, okay, you want more good engineers coming to our shop, like let's do open source, that helps the visibility and so on. And that's the kind of thing they want to think about. So I hope that we'll do more of those to our bosses.
Any more questions from the audience? Yeah.
Are you guys going to remain the open source forever, or depends on how much the price is?
Well, forever is a long time, so I don't know about that.
I have to admit that the freedom I have at Red Hat and the fact that it's open source and the fact that it's not like Red Hat did this, it's more like, Emmanuel did that and it works at Red Hat is a massive retention. The fact that I'm still there is has a big this has a big role. So yeah, forever is a long time, but I was actually wondering, like, okay, when I retired and I don't have anything, I'm not forced to do anything, then will I continue contributing? I don't know yet, but that fascinates me.
Yeah. I'm also entirely, I've been in this for so long, like a 100% open source role now in that form, and I cannot imagine having it any other way. I mean, of course I know that if there's an opportunity I could if I wanted to, but it's just such, well, I called it a privilege before, I guess. It is a privilege to be able to work like this. What you just mentioned, kind of the personal part of it, right? The being personally associated to the work that you're doing. You're not just in a role at a company contributing there. It's yourself contributing, and you happen to be paid by somebody. That is that part I really appreciate the most. There's maybe not to everybody's taste, but I do like this personal responsibility that is attached to it.
Oh, thank you. I was far away. No. One of the things I want to add is what I have seen as a part of this journey of open source communities and projects is the love that we are getting from the community. So it's amazing. Anytime you are doing a conference, you have a booth, or you are giving a talk, people are coming to you, not shouting at you because you have a bug or what have you, but they are telling you the love that they have for you, the project that you are building all together. And so this is super important to me because, yeah, getting all that love from you people is super important to me. And I used to work in a private company where we were doing software development and all those things that you have to pay for if you want to use it. And this is totally a different model. So, yeah, so I don't think I can work in another way than open source, no.
Well, since everyone is saying it's going to be forever, let me try to play the opposite position. So I think... Yeah, that's a great question. But what I was going to say is, I think the market forces surrounding open source has changed multiple times. Because in the early days, it was a university thing, and then it became like a vendor thing, and then now it's a single vendor thing, and now it's a cloud. So I think these things should continue to happen, I think. And then as a result of that, the standard mode of engagement, like how much it happens or how much it shrinks, I think there are going to be ups and downs. But I mean, I think, these guys' points, I think there's something fundamentally to human nature that I want to share what I created and then want to see happy faces of others. So that's the minimum baseline. But how far we can grow up from there, I think it depends on the market forces.
Now, we could sit for a couple more hours, I guess, discussing open source. But please do hang around. Our panelists will be around today towards the evening as well. And yeah, spread the love with open source. Thank you so much.